Good afternoon and welcome at the Diplomatic Academy's series, Diplomacy, Your Questions, Our Answers. For the Vienna School of International Studies, the COVID crisis is not only something which changes a lot of international topics on a global scale, but also in our immediate neighborhood. And for us, the Balkans has always been and will always be one of these priority areas. So the question we will discuss this afternoon is what are the consequences of the crisis for the relationship between the European Union and the Western Balkans. Austria has a very clear position. We have a straightforward yes to integration of all Western Balkan countries in the European Union. This is known, but is this true for the rest of the European Union? And where do we stand now? And will be the crisis of COVID be a game changer or not? And for this talk, we have invited the person who has most of the responsibility and I hope also possibilities to help this matter forward. It's Ambassador Johann Sattler. Welcome this afternoon.
Thank you.
Ambassador Sattler is the EU Ambassador and the EU Special Representative for Bosnia and Herzegovina. And he's also an alumnus of the Vienna School of International Studies. And he has a distinguished career, not only inside the foreign ministry, but also working for quite a few years in one of the rivals for influence of the Balkans in Moscow, as a CEO for the WATS Media Group first, and then as a publisher for the Axel Springer, Russia, Moscow. Before he came to the Western Balkans now, he was the head of the Department for the Western Balkans unit in the Foreign Ministry, the Austrian Foreign Ministry, and until last year, September of last year, the Austrian ambassador to Albania. So I guess we couldn't find a better speaker for this afternoon. The talk will be moderated by our European Studies Professor, Patrick Müller. Also welcome to you. Patrick Müller is our head for European Studies at the Vienna School of International Studies. With this, I actually wish you already a very intense and constructive discussion. And I hope that the subtitle of the talk of Ambassador Sattler is right. Enhanced ties against all odds. But with this, I pass on to Patrick Müller, the moderator of the talk. Please.
Yes, thank you so much, Ambassador Brix, and also welcome from my side to Ambassador Sattler. I would just like to briefly outline to all of us who join us today that we will do this in different blocks. So after about 15 minutes, you will already have the first opportunity to ask questions. You can send your questions either by email to conference@da-vienna.ac.at, or you may just also place a comment on our Facebook page, and I would collect these questions and then ask the questions for you. So please feel free already during the talk to approach us with your questions. And without much further ado, I would give the floor, so to speak, to Ambassador Sattler, and we are all very much looking forward to your observations.
Thank you very much, Professor Müller. Thank you, Ambassador Brix, lieber Emil. Dear students, good to be back with the Diplomatic Academy. I'm always a little bit sentimental when I'm with the Diplomatic Academy or in there. As you've said, I spent 2 good years there. And for me, this was in many respects a very special time, an eye-opener, also a source of inspiration in many fields. And of course, not to forget also, we had some very good parties in the bar of the Diplomatic Academy. I hope this institution is also still there. The topic is Western Balkans in times of COVID. What was the European Union's approach to this region during this crisis period, and what were the changes And let me start with two quite surprising things which happened these last 3-4 months here in the region, and also especially in Bosnia and Herzegovina. Number one, we had a relatively coherent and coordinated response by the authorities in this region, and especially also in Bosnia and Herzegovina. Now, for those of you who know this country, this is one of the really difficult things. Coordination, cooperation across boundaries is the real difficulty in this country. You know, the Dayton Constitution is put together a political system which led to peace, which was incredibly important, and we will always be grateful for the help from across the Atlantic, who played the major role then in '95. But also it allowed for a system with many possibilities to block, and a very decentralized system. You know, in this country we have about 14 governments, we have more than 140 districts. So this is always the biggest difficulty, to get a good coordination and get good responses when you need them quickly. Now, in this crisis, the response was really good overall. We had much more cooperation between the entities. You know, there are the permanent struggles and fights between Banja Luka and Sarajevo, Republika Srpska and Federation, but also the cooperation even within the Federation, where we have 10 cantons with a lot of competencies on their side. During this crisis, the coordination was good. The main decisions were taken together. This was one of the reasons that the figures are good. The figures in terms of infection rates, the figures in terms of death, 2,500 infections, 150 deaths in Bosnia and Herzegovina over the last 3 months. This is pretty good, and similar figures we have in the other countries in the region. So one thing was contributing to that was the coordination. Another thing, of course, was also that the countries here had a little bit more time to react. And while they saw what was going on in Europe, in Italy and other countries, they could prepare themselves, and they did the right thing. They acted early on and chose the right measures. Another reason I would also say, which really helped us, was the discipline of the people. Now, why was there so much discipline? I think a very important factor in this is that people knew this is very dangerous, and people also know the limitations of the health systems in this country and in this region. So people are really afraid, and really also, I think this was one of the reasons people really were very disciplined and stayed home, basically. The second surprising thing during this crisis, and this refers to the title of my talk today, is that the relationship between the European Union and this region was actually strengthened during this period. And I would start with the money envelope, the help in terms of coping with this crisis, which came from the European Union. It's a very sizable package of about 3 billion euros for these 6 relatively small countries. So 3 billion euros, more than 400 million for Bosnia and Herzegovina. Now, part of this is grants, about 80 million. So really bringing in the respirators. I mean, BIH, Bosnia and Herzegovina, had at the beginning of this crisis not more than 150 respirators for the whole country. This is a very, very low figure. So we of course did all we could in the very beginning to acquire respirators, ventilators, but also X-ray machines, which you need during this pandemic, and protective masks and everything. So this was the one part, 7 million just for medical equipment, and then about 70 million, 70 for helping businesses come through this difficult period of time, especially those on the front line, like tourism companies, but also companies who are engaged in transportation and so on. And then another part of our support to Bosnia and Herzegovina was macro financial assistance. This is basically money to help the country. This is a loan at very good, favorable conditions to help the country get over these difficult times when there will be a major shortfall in income from taxes. So this is the money envelope which we put on the table. As I said, for the whole region, this was more than 3 billion euros. But equally important than the money envelope is was the fact that we tried to include this region in the major European Union programs when it comes to coping with the crisis. Let me mention the Green Lanes initiatives. This we did within the European Union, but the Balkans were associated from the very beginning. This allowed for the flow of goods to go uninterrupted when borders were closed throughout Europe. Another important initiative where they were associated from the beginning was the civil protection mechanism. This is the mechanism we have inside the European Union when there are crises, when there are floods, when there are earthquakes, where we can very quickly help each other, European Union member countries, to tackle the crisis. And it was possible to include all the countries of the Western Balkans in this very initiative. Another thing, joint procurement, medical procurement. This was also started from the beginning of this crisis. In the meantime, all countries in this region joined the medical procurement initiative from the European Union side. So this is the second aspect. We basically treated this region like a member state. Now, in the very beginning, if you want, there was an inward turn, but this was also inside the European Union. Countries turned to themselves. And this is an understandable reaction. When there was panic, when we didn't know what was going on, countries turned inside, and we saw some frictions also between European Union member countries. And at that time, also there were problems with exporting medical equipment to the Balkans. There was never an authorization, there was never a ban on the export of this equipment. As it was reported in some media, there was the need for national authorities to give authorization if they wanted to export certain equipment, protective equipment especially. This was heavily criticized here, and the European Union took the right decision very early on, after a few weeks, already mid-April, to get rid of this authorization necessity. But apart from that, the response from the European Union side in terms of supporting this region was very good, and it's also recognized. And if you compare it to what other actors are doing in this region and have been doing, I think the good thing is to look at the figures. It's very clear who is the most loyal partner to this region, also showing, of course, how important that region for us is. Now, coming to Emil's question from the beginning, is that seen everywhere like that? No, we have 27 member states. There is, of course, a different view. Depends where you sit. Your perspective depends, of course, where you are. So Vienna, sitting in Vienna, is different than sitting in Lisbon. I mean, and obviously there are different nuances when it comes to the prioritization of this region. Having said that, there is really a growing understanding that we neglect, or the European Union neglects this region at our own cost. So it's much better to invest in this region. This region is very close to us in many respects, historically, culturally, politically, economically, and you only have to walk through the streets of Vienna to see how closely we are already now interconnected. So there is this growing understanding that we need to be very, very present in this region. We need to invest, and a good proof of that was that during the very height of this crisis, it was possible to, among the 27 member states, to agree on the opening of accession negotiations. EU accession negotiations with two countries here in the region, with North Macedonia and with Albania. This decision was taken by the foreign ministers of the 27 countries in March, when we were at the height of the crisis. Now, many people said, you remember there was this very difficult meeting of the Council, the European Council in October. There was no agreement on moving forward. And if you compare the situation today, when it comes to enlargement, when it comes to our policies to the Balkans, compared to where we were 6 months ago, we came a very long way. And it was surprising for many to see that we were able to move on that, to have the accession negotiations being opened, to have an agreement on a new methodology. This is also very important. There was question marks, some member state questions whether this, our approach we had over the last years is effective enough, is efficient enough. So there was a discussion among the member states. It was possible also in March to agree on a new methodology for the accession negotiations. And last not least, what was also very positive, we had a summit of the 27 European Union leaders, prime ministers, heads of states, with the 6 prime ministers of the Western Balkans in the beginning of May. You know, we are in the midst or towards the end of the Croatian EU presidency, and for Croatia being part of this region, it was very important that the Western Balkans was #1 priority during the presidency, and we were very happy that it was possible to have this summit, although it was a virtual summit, but still it took place. Many had thought that it will be postponed for the German presidency, but it took place. And by the way, it was the only outside interaction and outside activity of the 27 heads of state during that period of time. So everybody was focused, of course, on crisis management, but the leadership and the 27 also made this point to show how important this region is to the European Union. Coming to a close, let me just say, what are the lessons for the Western Balkans as I see them from this crisis? Basically, it's get your act together, and because the status quo is over as we have seen it, and I believe, at least sitting here in Sarajevo, but also watching the other countries, the reaction from the countries was good. Now it's very important to keep up the momentum. What I can say in Bosnia and Herzegovina is that during this period of time, also because there was a realization by the leaders that they need to change gear, that this permanent friction and going from one crisis to the next will not lead the country anywhere. There was a decision taken in April by the presidency of this country to move forward on the European Union accession path. They have answered finally to the, you know, there was a membership request by Bosnia and Herzegovina 3-4 years ago. Then there were many questions. This is the accession process. There are 3,000 to 4,000 questions being answered. This is their key. And then the European Union gave an answer in the form of the opinion. It's called the European Commission opinion on the membership application. Now, this was delivered last May, exactly a year ago, because of the blockades of lack of governments and other crises. There was no response given until now, last month, end of April, when there was finally the presidency getting their act together and saying, yes, we are serious now about, or more serious about also doing our homework. And they put together a framework for accession, for the next steps in the accession process, doing their homework basically in the different areas, from reforming the constitution when it comes to discrimination of certain groups of the population. There are a number of judgments from the European Court for Human Rights, Sedic Finci and others, to different areas where the country needs to make progress, including on the human rights front, but also especially on the rule of law, where we have a number of deficiencies which need to be overcome. So this is as far as I can tell you from the region here, from Bosnia and Herzegovina. One last point I would like to make, what I found very reassuring is to see that you remember when this new team in Brussels took over at the end of last year, there were basically 2 signature initiatives from Commission President von der Leyen. One was the Green Deal, and the other one was that they want to be a geopolitical commission. That they want to step up to the plate when it comes to also taking over responsibility throughout the world. But I was very happy to see, and also I must say, and I don't use this lightly, I was also proud to see that the European Union stepped up to the plate during this very crisis. You remember beginning of April, it was the European Union put together a package of assistance during this difficult period for the whole world, for partner countries throughout, from Asia to Latin America to Africa, and including the Balkans. 28 billion euros for the whole world, 3 billion out of which for this region. So this was the one thing. And the second thing, very also encouraging, there was a donors conference 3-4 weeks ago. It was organized by Commission President von der Leyen with more than 100 heads of states and prime ministers. And the one goal was to put together the contributions from the different countries to find a cure. To find a cure for COVID-19. It was in the end more than 9 billion euros which were put on the table, 1 billion out of which came from the European Union side. And I think this is what is needed. It's leadership in times of increasing rivalries between the blocs, between the US and China, between Russia and the US, that the European Union, as if you want, one of the last remaining champions of multilateralism, stepping up to the plate and taking over responsibility. I think this was very encouraging to see, and I believe this is the good thing we can take from this very crisis.
Thanks again for for describing the cooperation in the region and the EU's role in this cooperation. But also, I think it was very interesting how you fleshed out in the end now that the European Union is not the only actor who is active, and there are other important actors, and it sends a signal. So I would be quite interested in hearing from you. Is the European Union looking at the role played by China in responding to the COVID crisis as something that one could embed in a common approach and a common collaboration? Or is it more perceived as sometimes in the press that China is conducting its own, they call it sometimes mask diplomacy, and this is almost like a competition? Now, how do you see it from your perspective, coming from the region?
Yes, you're absolutely right. I mean, this is a bit of sometimes of a vanity fair, if you want. I mean, who is doing what, who is bringing in more, who is bringing in airplanes with protective equipment. It's also a bit of a battle of narratives, if you want. So especially what was going on, as we have seen, between China and the US, accusing each other of who was actually at the origin. I think this is quite unheard of. So yes, there is this dimension, I mean, there was also this controversy. I mean, when China then started getting in airplanes, it was not so much to Sarajevo but to Belgrade, and also the campaign then, which was very heavily pushed by the government in Belgrade, that these are our real brothers. I mean, just to underline here that it was the European Union which exported in January and February huge amounts of medical equipment to China, because at the time this was the epicenter of the epidemic, and later on, when China was over that very peak, they were able to help Europe, and I think this is what should be our message. This is not a time of turning inwards and a battle of narratives, but really of getting closer together and working together. This pandemic and most challenges we have now worldwide can only be fought together. It's really a myth if you think that this inward turning and this fencing off can lead to real sustainable solutions. We've also seen it in the European Union. The first weeks were very difficult because countries, and that's a natural tendency at the beginning, when you have a huge crisis, also in personal life, I guess. I mean, you turn inwards, you protect yourself, you protect the closest around you. But very quickly we found out that this is not the way to deal with the crisis, and solidarity was the one thing which can really bring us forward. And then you saw very encouraging examples of that, of helping each other, bringing the equipment to the places which needed it most, of getting patients out of the hardest hit places, out of Spain, out of Italy, to Germany, to Austria, to other places. I think this is the approach we need to take.
I say that our viewers have warmed up, and I'm receiving many questions. Okay. So I'm reading out now two for you in a row. So Stara Dukarali was asking, do you think the functioning cooperation during COVID-19 will accelerate the accession of candidate countries? And the second question would be by Kevin Kaiser. How do you see the engagement of other actors, China and Russia, in the region with regard to disinformation campaigns?
On the first question, will it accelerate the accession process of the countries in the region to the European Union? It depends very much on the country's response here. I think some of them got the message that business as usual is over. Also, the status quo is over. So they really have to act to get their act together. There will be not necessarily more attention to this region. The focus in the next years in the European Union will be on the economic recovery, and it will take some years to get back to where we were. So it's very much in the interest of these countries to get their act together, to give the right answers, and also, if you want, become more serious about doing the necessary reforms. You know, this is a two-way street. It takes two to tango, and this was very beautiful, by the way, in the summit declaration from Zagreb, 6th of May. I can only encourage you to read that. It was basically saying, well, two things. One, yes, we have this clear perspective from our side, from the European Union side, for you to become members of this very European Union. You're the last ones, by the way. The 6 countries of the Western Balkans are the last ones who have the firm perspective to be joining the European Union. But we expect something from you. We expect that you live up to what you promised. We expect that you actually do the painful reforms when it comes to the judiciary, when it comes to public finances, when it comes to a rule of law. And we expect you also to live up to the values of the European Union and to stand with us, with the European Union, when the going gets tough. So I think this was maybe not so clear always. We were not always so clear in the past when we were communicating to this region that there's a lot of expectations we have also from this region. It's not only one side, you know, the European Union side, you know, we're very often criticized that we're not doing enough, we're not quick enough, but there is also another side of the map.
Thank you so much. Yes.
And yes, there was one more question on the disinformation, and you mentioned 2 countries there, China and Russia. Yes, we see this happening. We see also different degrees of intensity of these campaigns. Some countries are more targeted than others. We see in Bosnia and Herzegovina some being the target from especially Russia, but to a lesser extent, if you want, than Serbia. But yes, we do notice that, and we have actually also established a few years ago a strategic communication task force in Brussels to be looking at especially 2 areas. One, the former Soviet Union, and the second one also the Balkans, the Western Balkans. So yes, we feel this and we look at this very and follow this very carefully.
May I get in with 2 questions? Is that possible?
Of course.
I would like to ask Ambassador Sattler, after his very optimistic talk about the situation from the side of the European Union, whether he believes there are various things that are not so positive. For instance, one of the first reactions from the European Union side, and Vienna was part of it, was talking about migration routes again. Just today, there was a video meeting of ministers of interior of the region and of Austria talking about how to close the Western Balkan routes that exist. Is this not a sign that we are still in a situation where national interest, regional interest from the Austrian side or from the European side is prevalent? And do you see this as a problem, or do we have simply to live with that? For instance, in the Austrian public, the idea of migration is of the utmost concern for politicians, and so we have to deal with it. That's my first question. And the second, could you explain why you think we are going beyond the situation of business as usual? You were stressing that now the region and the countries of the region have to do something else. Do you think that this has to do with the fact that in the economic crisis that we will experience in the European Union, there might be less intention to invest economically in the Western Balkan countries? And what are your ideas of how more investment can be attracted in spite of the economic crisis that we are experiencing? Sorry for two quite less optimistic questions.
No, thank you, Ambassador. Very important questions. First, on the migration, yes, I believe this is one of those topics which, looking back now, especially also to 2015, and what this had as consequence in many countries of the European Union, in terms also of rise of populism. You know, this is a very, very peculiar, difficult and dividing topic. So I think politicians are naturally inclined to use that topic also to a certain extent, and I think we have to take this this topic very, very seriously. We have when it comes to Bosnia and Herzegovina, I mean, this topic of migration is very high on my agenda, just for the fact that there is always problems here in Bosnia and Herzegovina, although the numbers here are relatively low. I mean, we have about 6,000 to 8,000 migrants here, but due to the difficulties in coordination, in getting together national policies and strategies, we don't have, for instance, a national strategy on migration. So what we have come to realize, unless we step in and help Bosnia and Herzegovina here to help and tackle this migration challenge, you know, the migrants will be on the street, because there is no enough reception centers, and therefore we stepped in the last 2 years quite strongly and helped them putting up new migration centers, also partially running them in the absence of a proper migration strategy from the side of the government in Sarajevo. One side aspect, 90% of the migrants are concentrated in one part of the country, which is the northwest. This is the country close to the Croatian border, because that's where the migrants want to go out. They don't want to stay in Bosnia and Herzegovina. They want to go to through Croatia and then through Germany, to Austria, to Italy, to other countries. So this is a really difficult part for me, also because one part of the country, namely the Republika Srpska, flatly denies that it has anything to do with these migrants and doesn't want to take even one of them. So this makes it especially difficult if one region, a relatively small one, bears the brunt of the migration crisis in this country. So yes, I mean, I agree, this migration will be with us for a very long time. As we speak, we have about 100,000 migrants in Greece, either on the islands or on the mainland, and they want to move. And they look for the route which is the most promising. Despite some announcement that the Western Balkan route is closed, it was never closed. Right? So it was also, to be clear here, there was always a possibility to get through, and also the route has been changing. But what's for Bosnia and Herzegovina, for instance, at the moment, this route from Greece through North Macedonia, Serbia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, and then further on, seems relatively open, meaning that people still get through. So that's why also this is attractive for migrants to come and take this very route. So yes, I believe this is a topic which will be with us. But we've also seen in 2015 that because of the cooperation with the Western Balkans, it was possible to very much reduce the flow of illegal migration, and therefore also the close cooperation since then we have with this region. And it was the Austrian Chancellor who had who played a strong role in that. But this was also one of the realizations that how close this region is and how important it is for us strategically to be present there, to invest, and to get this region into the European Union as soon as possible. On your second question, yes, I'm not sure whether everybody understood here yet that business as usual is over. I think what was I referring to is that, and what you mentioned is, it's going to be more difficult to get investments unless these countries get direct together and actually work on getting better conditions to get investments. Because it's very much for the investors the area of rule of law, which is the game breaker, if you want. If you have several opportunities to invest, and investors these days have a lot of opportunities where they could invest. The big advantage of this region is it's very close to the European Union, that you have a relatively skilled workforce and low wages. So all of this is actually a clear advantages. And given that, there could be many more investments. But because especially of the problems with the rule of law, that you have to fear, especially if you're a smaller or small or medium-sized enterprise and you want to invest, that you actually get into big-time troubles if you get in problem with the judiciary. If you make an investment and then suddenly you find out the plot of land you bought or are using is actually in somebody else's title. And I have many of these examples when I was in Albania before, and now also in Bosnia and Herzegovina. So therefore, I think the realization here is that if there aren't real changes when it comes to rule of law, strengthening judiciary independence, it's going to be very difficult to attract here further investments.
Thank you so much for these comprehensive answers. In the meanwhile, some more questions dropped in. So let me just read to you. The next question would be, has there also been cooperation between the Western Balkan countries during the pandemic, and are the different ethnic groups moving closer together? Or do you think that the pandemic will rather increase tensions?
During the crisis, we've actually seen a good cooperation. Let me mention just one example. The Green Lane initiatives, which started from the European Union side, allowing the uninterrupted flow of goods, was very quickly extended to the Western Balkans. But there was also a similar initiative taken from the Western Balkan 6, and we had the Regional Cooperation Council, which is seated in Sarajevo, was very instrumental in that, in putting together something similar between the 6 countries, so that you had, in the beginning there was huge queues, lines on the border between, for instance, Bosnia and Herzegovina and Serbia, between Serbia and North Macedonia, and taking this good example from the Green Lane initiatives and putting it to practice in the Western Balkans. This helped a lot in reducing the waiting times and in getting the goods where they needed to go. So this was a very good and encouraging signal. Now, will it have also positive consequences when we go forward, further integration? I don't know. I hope so. As you know, this is something we have been pushing very strongly the last 3-4 years. It was at one of the summits of the Berlin process. I think it was in Italy in 2017, where there was the regional economic area was conceived, and the idea is to really get this region much closer in terms of economic integration. Also, in a way, as a training ground for the European Union, like a bit what we had in Scandinavia before Finland, Sweden joining the European Union. They worked together very well in the EFTA, and this was a good training ground for getting rid of barriers. One thing are the tariffs, but the other thing, very importantly, which is often forgotten, are the non-tariff barriers, which are very, very problematic in the Western Balkans. For instance, recognition of certificates of origin, recognition of diploma. We still have a huge issue with diploma from Belgrade universities not being recognized in Sarajevo or not being recognized in Tirana. This has huge impact on people not being able to move. So basically working very much on the 4 freedoms in this region. This is very high on our agenda, and I hope we can make progress there over the next years.
Yes. The next question would relate to border control, and specifically it asks, did the European Union give help to Bosnia for border control, and if it did, how much?
I cannot give you exact figures, but this is an area we are very heavily invested, and we have been helping and working on this for many, many years, because since many of you have been traveling through this region, I know you have this beautiful study trip always in May, unfortunately not this year, but basically traveling by bus through most of these countries. You know how difficult this is sometimes, even if you're announced, even you have all the connections in your case through the embassies you need, but still it's quite cumbersome, and even more so if you're not announced and if you are a business. And so this is a very important area. I mean, this is also an argument. One thing is we speak a lot about connectivity, of getting more highways, of getting the connections, better connections between the capitals, building highways. But the best highway doesn't help you anything if you're then stuck at the border for 2 hours for different reasons, because it takes ages until things are processed. So yes, this is a very important area we are working on. We are also working on physical infrastructure. Many border crossings have been revamped and brought to modern European standards with European Union money, especially here also in Bosnia, but also I remember in Albania, for instance, there is the border crossing between Albania and Kosovo, the main one, which is the highway connecting these 2 countries. This was done by the European Union, as was the border crossing between the main one between Albania and Montenegro. By the way, this is the only one in the Balkans where you have only one border crossing, if you want. So they don't have 2, as usually is the case, but you have really a physically integrated one border booth. So you show your passport once. Inside you have both an Albanian and a Montenegrin policeman and customs official, and it works very well. And it actually could be a very good example also for other countries.
Thank you. There would be another question probably hidden in a comment, and here it was stated, and I think it comes from the region. I get the feeling that we get to know more from the EU ambassador than from our own politicians. And I think this question alludes to communication, and it's often highlighted that in this kind of crisis, especially a health crisis, communication is of essence. So maybe you could share your thoughts, how you observed how politicians in the region communicated with the public.
Good question, or more comment. But shows you also a little bit the gap between the elites or the political elites and the population as such. So yes, I mean, there is a lot to do and a lot to improve. And when it comes to crisis communication, and having seen, you know, how important this communication component is in times of crisis. And we have seen good examples in many European countries, that you have your daily press conference, that you have a politician, and it needs to be the boss. And this was a huge crisis, so the boss needs to be there. But then also the Minister of Health, and then also an expert. By the way, this is one of the things that one of the takeaways from this crisis, I believe, apart from more trust in the governments, I think it was heartening to see how important the role of good government is in terms of crisis. And I believe actually one of the takeaways from this is that government per se will be perceived in general more positive. I mean, this is of course different from country to country, but in general, I believe this is one of the takeaways from this crisis. Yes, and so communication is key. What I've seen here in the region, it's been a bit bumpy. So what was good was the general reaction in terms of taking the right decisions, giving very strong, putting in place very strong measures. But when it comes to communicating on a daily basis with the population, I mean, there's a lot to improve, I must say. And this goes back to the gap between the elites and the political elites and the population as such. So there is a lot of frustration also. And what we see, unfortunately, one of the really negative trends and one of the things which is really hard to watch and very negative for all the countries is the huge pace of emigration of people leaving this region. And one of the reasons, apart from the economic side, but we see more and more when we do our research that a major factor, a motivating factor for people leaving this region is actually the lack of perspective and this mistrust, this lack of trust that things will really change. So this is a very, very important issue which was raised.
Thank you so much. Maybe I could jump in here with a follow-up question on your comments, because you portrayed it in a very interesting way, how the management of the COVID crisis could actually increase trust, also maybe on the demand side, the demand for good governance. But at the same time, we have seen inside the European Union with some member states that exactly the opposite happened, that under the shadow of the health crisis, governments took measures that were viewed by Brussels quite critically, kind of as more backsliding from democracy and good governance rather than the opposite. And we have two countries now under Article 7 proceedings at the moment in the European Union. We have other countries that are not under Article 7 proceedings but have major rule of law issues too. How is this perceived in a region that looks for the enlargement perspective since many years, and some countries it has been becoming more concrete? But how do they look, when we try to promote these values and policies abroad? How is it perceived if the internal house in Europe is probably not as in order as we would all wish?
Difficult question, but thank you anyway for raising it. First of all, it's very important and good that we have these two Article 7 procedures going on. It's very important and necessary to also get to an end of these processes and to a result. So there needs to be, because your point, I mean, what does it do to us here? Of course, it makes it more difficult to communicate the message that rule of law is the alpha and omega of everything. Of course, we have an issue of credibility here at stake. All the more it's important that we have these proceedings going on in the European Union, just to say it's not only on paper, we take it also seriously. Now, concretely, we've seen some governments in the region, but I think it was rather the exception. We have seen, taking special decrees. We have seen that here in one part of this country, in the Republika Srpska, a number of decrees being decided upon, and special powers being given to the president of the Republika Srpska because of the COVID crisis. And we could clearly see, this was a bit of a copy-paste to what's been happening in some EU member states. So we voiced that criticism, and it was actually very quickly also understood that this is not the way to go, that we are watching. And so was done was to put a very strict time measure to the decrees. And as we speak now, these decrees are already out of force. So these special powers which were given to the RS president are not there anymore. So this was reassuring to see that they have reacted very quickly on our criticism. But you know, it's a valid point that you know, we cannot preach you know, or preach water and drink wine. I mean, this is the old thing we always have to keep in mind. I saw a very interesting article from a great philosopher and political scientist who is actually sitting in Vienna, Ivan Krastev, on this crisis will be doing to all of us and what changes there will be. And he wrote it, I think, quite in the beginning of the crisis. Interesting to look at it, that actually many of the things predicted, one of them that the trust in governments in general will be on the rise. Also the trust in experts, also something which I believe has very much been realized. And one thing I'm not sure is going to come, and I have not seen this very much except for in the beginning, but then also a strong reaction against it, is this giving more prominence to the nation state.
Yeah.
That the nation state is the one entity which can protect you, you know, borders and everything. I think the jury is still out on this one. We've seen some of it in the very beginning, but we've also seen a lot of good examples going in the other direction as the crisis moved on then. So I believe that this is one of the things, luckily, I hope that will not become reality.
Yes. Thank you so much, Ambassador. I think we are nearing the end of this talk and of this format. So then, of course, then it's on me, Ambassador Sattler, to thank you very much again on our behalf. I think there was a lot to take away, and it's always, I think, maybe one of the nice side effects now of doing this online, that we can get in touch with interesting people all over the world and have them with us, and then of course share all this information that comes directly out of a region. I think it's a region where the European Union has in total 3 special representatives. So I think that also shows on the one hand the strong interest, but also that is a region with real challenges. And it was very interesting to hear today how this translates through the perspective of the COVID-19 response. So thank you so much for these insights.
Thank you very much, Professor, and also Ambassador Brix, and a big thanks to all of you who were with us today around this virtual table in Vienna or worldwide. I understand we also have students or people listening in from many different places. So great to be with you and be telling you a little bit about my realities here on the ground in Sarajevo. Sarajevo is a place to visit. It's a very historic place. Many important things took place here. But it's also a very beautiful place. The place where you can see the Balkans and also a little bit of the former Yugoslavia in one spot. So don't be shy. Visit. Pass by my office. I will be always happy to seeing people, especially from my alma mater, from Diplomatic Academy.
Thank you very much for joining us, Johann. Thank you.